through the summer and through the first week of August. We have 1 week off around the 4th of July. If anyone is here for CLE credit, is anyone here for CLE credit? Okay. Oh, okay. The sign-up sheet is in the back of the room. Yeah, so just make sure you sign in. And there are also Hot Topics brochures by the sign-in sheet. This is a brown bag event, so I see a lot of you guys brought your lunch, so feel free to enjoy your lunch during the lecture. And following Pamela's presentation, there will be a short Q&A. We do have to end at 5 before 1 because a bunch of our students and some of our faculty have classes at 1, so we have a pretty hard stop. And I, just so you all know, I think I know most of you, but I am Laurie Baranovan. I'm the director of our Center for Ag and Food Systems and a professor at Vermont Law School. I'm really thrilled to introduce and welcome Pamela Vesilind for this Hot Topics. Professor Vesilind teaches animal law, food law, and environmental law courses, both residentially and online. And she also, this year, has been teaching civil procedure and professional responsibility. Her scholarship focuses on industrial animal agriculture and the constitutional implications of regulating interactions between human and non-human animals. It's a mouthful. She's licensed to practice in both Vermont and North Carolina, where she formerly practiced animal law, and has a JD from BLS and an LLM from the University of Arkansas in food and ag law. And this is her 7th year of teaching the law of animals and agriculture in our summer session program. Pamela's topic, or the name of her presentation, is Farming Nemo, the CAFOs of the Sea. So please welcome Pamela Vesilind.
Thank you, Laurie. I appreciate that. Also, I have to tell you, I really detest puns. And then I used 2 in the title of this, which is unforgivable, actually. Especially because I've actually never seen Raising Nemo or Finding Nemo or Don't Tell My Niece. Anyway, this is a hot topic in that it's so hot that although I teach a class called The Law of Animals and Agriculture, I don't actually have a section or a day devoted to aquatic animals and agriculture. But after this year, I'm not going to be able to omit them any longer. I'm going to have to, something's got to give. And I'm going to have to add them because today, with the alarming depletion of fishing stocks in the wild, the practice of aquaculture or farmed fishing, 2 terms I'm going to use interchangeably today, has had a meteoric rise and is often considered by many to be sort of the solution, if you will, to the problem of depleting stocks of fish in open water bodies. Unfortunately, I do apologize, I do come bearing some bad news. It's time to start thinking about the welfare of these aquatic animals. And I don't even just mean the fish, but also the shellfish. Creatures that we raise and catch and otherwise harvest for food. If you're one of those people who, like me for a long time, stopped eating meat but kept eating fish because it was a good compromise, you still have something you could eat at a wedding, that sort of thing. I'm sorry in advance for how that might change your life a little bit, or not to say that I intend to change your eating practices, never mind. No, but in all seriousness, I think that for the longest time, I was under the same misperception that the general public is. I don't by any stretch of the imagination think that you are representative of the general public. You are a self-selecting group of cynical, well-educated individuals who know way too much about our food system. But with that in mind, I suspect there are still some people in this group or online who believe that when it comes to animal welfare or animal even cognition, that there's a fundamental difference between terrestrial animals and aquatic animals. And that's where the news gets a little disappointing, not for the fish, but for those of us who rely on that misperception, that in fact the science is showing quite opposite, that fish are capable of much more sophisticated cognition or cognitive activity and thinking and behavior, use of tools, et cetera, than we ever thought possible. But let's back up. As I said, fish farming or aquaculture is considered the solution that's going to feed the world. Perhaps for those of you who have been studying food law for a while, that argument that we need technologies or practices that will feed the planet or feed the world, that's a familiar refrain that's kind of re-emerging today as it applies to aquaculture, even so much as it has merited at least one TED Talk, so you know it's got to be important. Aquaculture or fish farming could mean the raising of fish in open waters or on land. In either case, the fish are raised in confinement. And in aquaculture, they spend their entire life cycle in some type of confinement. They are in all, just to put it bluntly, they are the CAFOs of the water, if you will, whether the containers are on land or in open water bodies. These are, if you consider that CAFO stands for Confined Animal Feeding Operation, that's what we've got here. And as it happens, because it is really another form of CAFO, a lot of the same externalities that you find in terrestrial CAFOs exist with aquaculture. From environmental perspectives, whether we're talking about land-based or open water-based confinement, you have genetically or selected breeding practices that create fish that are bred to produce and produce well and quickly in confined environments. Because there is that genetic conformity, when some of them inevitably escape into the open waters, in the case of open water systems, there is the concern about the detriment to the local ecosystems that these invasive species could have. Whether we're talking about land-based or water-based systems, the fact that there are so many fish in a confined area means you're going to also have a lot of fish excrement. And that excrement and leftover food contaminates the water, whether it's in the open water system or when a land-based system, when those tanks are flushed out, that water has to be, becomes an effluent that goes somewhere. That's going to be a pollutant in the same way that water, whether it's storm water or water that comes from terrestrial CAFOs, a lot of the same environmental issues involved with that, depleting oxygen in water, high ammonia content, et cetera. Other sort of examples of environmental concerns are for land-based systems, you've got predators that will come to obviously shop at the local fish farm, and sea lions or sea birds, they risk becoming poisoned or shot by aqua farmers, not uncommon. But that's another class, because the environmental aspects of fish farming, that is a whole class, and it's not quite as hot of a topic as the welfare aspects. And there are significant welfare aspects. These fish are bred in captivity. They spend their whole lives. Isn't that beautiful? It's beautiful, and yet it's also horrifying, but we'll get to that in a second. Here's the aquaculture journey of a fish that's raised in confinement. So the welfare aspects, or the introduction of concerns about welfare, could happen at any point during the system. As for the most part, the largest concerns about the welfare of fish occurs in the confinement itself and in the slaughtering process, which is something that not a lot of people think about, but how animals die and how they are taken from the water and how they die and what process is used to do that, those raise significant welfare implications. There are no federal laws that have any reference even to fish or other aquatic animals as far as welfare goes. That's for those, especially for those in my Law of Animals of Agriculture class, that shouldn't come as a big surprise because there really is only one federal law that has any significant impact on animals in agriculture, and that's the Federal Meat Inspection Act. I promise I didn't want to raise that, I apologize. But we've been spending a lot of time in that act lately. But there is no such thing for aquatic animals. Welfare hasn't even been much of a consideration at all until very, very recently. I try to explain at the very beginning of each animal law class, whatever it is that we're studying, that our laws that, whether it's at the state or federal level or local ordinances, the laws that create some standards for how animals should be treated, or that regulate the way that we handle them or manage them or feed them or seek treatment for them, they all arise from a pretty rational, I think, a reasonable concept that we want to protect and ensure the protection of animals that we have some relation to, or at least some knowledge of or association with, empathy for. So if you look at laws that apply to our interactions, human interactions with animals, the animals that are protected the most are domesticated animals, are pets, dogs, cats. I don't know why then my next thought was ferret, because I don't know anybody that owns a ferret. And under some animal cruelty laws, ferrets would not apply. But the animals that we keep as pets, that live in our homes, that sometimes sleep in our beds, these obviously are the animals that we have the greatest associations with and the greatest empathy for. We can look into their eyes and see emotions. Even if science isn't willing to back us up on certain ideas that we have about our animals, we don't care. We know our pets, and we're willing to support policies and laws that protect them from cruelty. Great. But then there's a whole other category of animals that is protected by law, but in a very different way, and those are wildlife animals. The deer, squirrels, all the animals, the skunks that are out now and on the road at night, be careful. These are wildlife animals. We perceive them differently, but we do have exposure to them, and we have some, especially because in an area like this, we live among them, they live among us, and so we appreciate that there is state regulation of animals in the wild. They're regulated completely differently, usually as essentially part of the public trust, as another natural resource, if you will. But we accept that they have legal protections. The animals that are used in research or for entertainment, say as zoos, petting zoos, on television, or in medical research, those animals, we can sort of classify them as animals that travel in interstate commerce. They also have some legal protections, but not as many. We don't see them as often either. We are confronted with them when we get an email from PETA or there's been some undercover video that's been published, and now we have to once again think about primates in research. But for the most part, we don't see them quite that much. There are some legal protections for those animals, and we do still have some empathy for them because we have exposure and because, well, actually our very first significant federal welfare law was the Animal Welfare Act, and that was designed to protect dogs that were dogs being used for research purposes. At the bottom of that are animals in agriculture. We don't see them very often. I was challenging my students last week in this great dairy state of Vermont, go for a drive and find the cows. Where are the cows? You're not going to find very many cows because a lot of them are indoors. They're being raised indoors. Not to say all of them, of course, but that even in a place with the bucolic reputation as Vermont, that the realities of food production, industrial food production, are that even dairy cows in Vermont, a lot of them are raised inside. So our connection to farmed animals is becoming more and more tenuous. We don't see a lot of what happens inside of large confinement buildings, if you will. And yet, more and more, especially over the last 10 to 15 years, we meaning the general US public, have become more conscious of their suffering and the treatment of them and the slaughter, and it's the reason why I have a job that I get to teach this class. That people are interested in, at least enough of you are interested in taking that class and learning more. Like we're starting to care more because we're learning more about how our food is raised. So we've got all of that, right? What about the fish? The thing about fish is we don't hear them. They don't look like us. Even if we can see the facilities like I was showing on these slides, all we're really looking at are like the walls of the containers. So even just our daily general interactions with fish are they don't promote or they don't support any conclusion that we have a lot in common with them. And so it shouldn't be any big surprise that it's been only until really the last decade that the common perception has been that fish aren't even sentient, that they don't feel pain. And even I would say that although science has, for the most part, put that away and dispelled that notion, there are still a couple of outlier scientists that believe that they don't. But the vast majority of scientific studies show that not only do fish feel pain, but they have, as I said earlier, pretty sophisticated cognitive abilities. They have preferences. They have fears. We don't know exactly how much they feel pain or how they feel pain because that is a subjective idea. In the same way that Allison might be able to tell me how much her tooth aches, I still am not going to be able to feel what she feels. If Allison were a dog, she wouldn't be able to tell me. I might be able to see her toothache and take her to the doctor, but my separation from her pain is that much more. If Allison is a fish, it's very unlikely that I would ever know that you had a toothache. But my point is that we are practically speaking and just realistically not disposed to have the kind of empathy for fish because we just don't identify with them as much. Luckily, there are numerous scientists now practicing, conducting studies, research on aquatic animal cognition and finding that it's unfortunate but true that we do really have to consider the welfare of these animals. There's one scientist in particular, his name's Colin Brown, who's written really an excellent piece that I commend to you if you're at all interested in this, called Fish Intelligence, Sentience, and Ethics. And he discusses at great length the idea that fish in agriculture have a dual challenge. One is the fact that there's been this misperception for a long time that they don't feel pain. And two is that we are not disposed to support or to try and generate public or political will to enact laws that address their welfare because they're so different from us. And yet, I've been thinking a lot about this idea, and I say it's a hot topic in that I'm just thinking about how to add this to the course, but I've been thinking about fish in relationship to hens, or I should say more accurately what the industry calls broiler chickens, chickens that are raised for meat. Fish raised in aquaculture are in the billions in the United States today, second only to chickens. And about 9 billion chickens are slaughtered each year in the United States. For a long time, they were excluded from discussions of animal welfare. Mostly we were talking about the livestock, the cows, pigs, goats and sheep also, but mostly those two. And chickens raised for meat were, well, we came honestly by the phrase bird brain, running around like a chicken with their head cut off, right? It's only been fairly recently that animal behaviorists have been able to identify or learn more about what hens go through as far as their quality of life in a CAFO environment. Learning more than just what the physiology tells us, not just how their what level of hormonal response they have to different stimuli, but also what preferences do they have if given the choice to exhibit their natural behavior and follow their instincts, what would they do or not do? And that type of study has really changed the way we understand poultry birds or avian agriculture birds. We realize that they actually do have pretty sophisticated ways of looking at I was about to say at the world, that's really kind of silly, but at their own lives that they have, that there's a reason why we have to manipulate their bodies and their environments in order to raise them in this high density environment that we currently do. We have to clip their beaks so that they don't peck at each other. We have to, depending on which facility or operation we're talking about, they may be administered antibiotics to prevent or to promote growth or to prevent some type of infection or disease. Same thing is happening to fish. The science is improving when it comes to fish. So it seems to me pretty likely that we're going to have to start dealing with planning for the welfare, or at least trying to regulate the welfare of the animals raised from out of water bodies. At most, or I should say at least, we need to plan for coming up with some type of humane slaughter. Most fish are fully conscious during the slaughter process. That can take up to several minutes. The conventional now way of slaughtering livestock animals is regulated in the United States, saying that the animals must be rendered insensible is what the law says, but unconscious before they're hoisted and shackled and their carotid artery is cut, before they are actually, that's the slaughter process. But that rendering the animal insensible or rendering them unconscious so that they don't feel any pain while they're being slaughtered, that's not something that in any way is a consideration for fish in this country, or for that matter in the world. The Europeans have conducted some studies and are considering some options for humane slaughter of fish, but nothing has, but we're not there yet. But I think that's coming. What we do see are third-party labeling programs that promise sustainable or humane treatment of fish, and whether or not they do exactly what they claim to do is really outside the scope of this talk, and something that I'm still learning myself. So that's pretty much all that I wanted to share with you, that our moral circle is going to have to get bigger. And I know that we have the room for that. The question is, do we have the political will to do anything about it? Or are we going to allow the fish to be subject to the same kind of dated messages that were used to support or to promote industrial terrestrial animal agriculture a couple decades ago, that we need to institute this type of system because we have to feed a growing planet, that this is a sustainable method because it uses less land, that it's efficient because it's a lot cheaper. These arguments no longer work to excuse the externalities and the suffering of animals in terrestrial animal agriculture. So we have to decide whether or not we're going to allow them to excuse it in this growing field of aquaculture. And I also recommend to you, if you're interested in more of this, there are a number of books, including this one by a professor at Penn State University. She's done a heck of a lot of really interesting studies about how fish show us what it is that they feel. And there are some great videos online about that as well. So with that, I'm happy to try and answer any questions or have a conversation about this hot topic. I will also tell you that there is a brand new division within the Animal Law Center at Lewis and Clark that is devoted to aquaculture or aquatic animals. That's always a good indicator of something new in animal law. And, oh, that's a good ending. Put that down there. Thank you. Again, I'm sorry. Thanks. Yes.
So there's no federal law, so states are free to do what they might wish to do in terms of addressing the issues you presented?
So there could not have been a better question, thank you. It's almost as if I mentally telepathed that to you. Absolutely. And that's where aquaculture differs from other industrial animal agriculture, because we're struggling with that question about what can states do or not do when it comes to the welfare of terrestrial animals raised for food. But states could enact laws at the state level that implement certain welfare standards. At this point, yes.
There is something called the Commerce Clause that might possibly impact.
There is.
Just saying.
Well, how would that spin out then?
Just saying.
Well, true. That is true. And it would be a brand new test. We would have some cases to go on. The bigger the market gets for farm-raised fish, the more difficult it is to fight a Commerce Clause, or actually a Dormant Commerce Clause challenge. What I think that a state would have in its favor in defending it is a lack of any congressional action over the treatment of fish, whether during their confinement and being raised and slaughter. So I tend to think, without spending a lot of time on this, that at this point, the states would have a better chance at being able to survive a Dormant Commerce Clause challenge.
If your goal is to stop some of these CAFOs in the sea, there's always the Clean Water Act that applies to these, because these are discharges into navigable waters. And states can have more stringent laws than the feds do. If the feds are unwilling to enforce Clean Water Act discharge requirements, then you can use state laws.
Yes, and yet we already have that problem, right, with existing agriculture. And so it would need to be a state that's willing to implement those kinds of heightened standards. So if you're operating a land-based fish farm, this is one of those least common denominator. Like you would move to a state that didn't have those kinds of heightened standards. Not to say that, it's a tool in the toolbox, but it's unfortunately not enough yet, right? Jerry.
With the Clean Water Act, would you, with the same, because it doesn't regulate runoff from like industrial farms or anything like that, so would the same thing apply here? Like even if it's like in the sea, do you think they would have that as runoff if it leaks out into like the ocean or any other water? Could you even regulate that?
Well, okay, so I don't want to get too far out of my comfort zone here, but so I would say if you are actually, let's say you have a land-based system and you are switching out the water, like so you're actually going to drain a tank into a water body, you would have to get a NPDES permit for that, right? As far as it being an open waters, I don't know exactly how that would apply. Same thing, yeah.
This is very rich, thank you. I
Oh.
just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about how you're theorizing the moral basis for greater regulatory protection. And I heard a couple different things. I heard theories of cognition, theories of pain, and maybe kind of lurking in the background utilitarian ideas about environmental harm. And so cognition worked for you, or worked, I should say, for me most persuasively as a kind of theory of the lack of political will, right? Why are we not caring about fish? They're not like us. We don't understand how they think the way we think. And I thought of Peter Singer's argument about cognition as a kind of dangerous basis for expanding animal rights, right? We don't sort of think of human animals as rights-bearing because they have cognition, right? Babies or elderly or people who are, and then at the end, maybe I thought it was really pain doing the work for you for a prescriptive argument, not cognition. But I don't know, maybe you're still working it out as well, but I just thought, say more.
Oh, no, I would say I've basically begun, right? I think obviously you're right. The problem with using that hierarchical standard where you take whatever the prevailing science says about the level of cognition of an animal and you assign wealth or value to it rather based on how well they think. Like do they recognize themselves in the mirror? Do they use tools? Do they have language that we at least interpret as language? Different ways that we decide that it matters. And yet, Peter Singer would say, no, the question is really what Jeremy Bentham asked, which was not can they think, but can they suffer? And if they can suffer, doesn't that then create an obligation on our behalf to acknowledge that? But I think fish are uniquely disadvantaged because of the long-held belief that not only that they didn't feel that they weren't, smart, right, or have inner lives, but that they didn't feel pain at all. And so, I'm not even sure what your question is anymore.
More for you about, that was a fine answer, but the moral basis for you driving,
Oh, the moral
if we're gonna
basis?
Mobilize people around animal welfare. I heard cognition and I heard pain, and they were kind of tangled together, and it was an invitation to maybe separate them.
I feel really funny about getting into that too much because I don't believe that, at least my job is to rely on the moral basis for establishing welfare for animals. Like I really, like I feel like if I walk into a class and start by saying you need to care about animals, that right then I'm going to turn off anybody who's in there who thinks that I'm judging them and telling them that they're in some way there's something wrong with them, that they aren't where I am in my thinking about how animals should be protected. Instead, I think it's important to, at least in my role right now, is to look at it in terms of, well, let's say we do want to establish enhanced protections or some protections for animals. How might that look? What are the existing legal challenges to that? Et cetera, which is taking a step away from it. But I obviously think that personally, and like I do tell my class, like, of course I wish that you would all be vegans, but that's not what the class is about, right? So, I mean, but go for it.
So as a follow-up to that, I think for when people are thinking about animal welfare, most humans don't care about the animal. Like, the animal's pain and suffering is not the thing that's going to make people like want stricter regulations for CAFOs. But when you start to make the connection to the food supply and the food that they're eating and the resulting impacts on the human environment, then people start to care. So I wonder with aquaculture, are there similar, so like with CAFOs, there are these suggestions that the raising of animals like that makes the meat potentially not as safe. So there's a safety issue for humans, and then humans start to get worried and think, I don't want to eat that meat that's raised like that. Are there similar concerns with aquaculture that you could raise to people to make them feel more concerned about that as an issue?
Sure. I mean, because there aren't really a whole lot of regulations as far as the food safety go for fish to begin with. But there again, I find that to be sort of a dangerous entry point too, because if you say you should care about, you should care about the way that we treat hens that lay eggs, right? That they have at least enough room to be able to spread their wings and turn around and not live in tiny cages. I can come up with food safety, environmental, honestly, antitrust. There's lots of different tools you can put in your toolbox to attack those animal management practices. The problem with doing that is that there are workarounds. And I remember one summer when I was in law school, I spent a summer at the Southern Environmental Law Center in their North Carolina office, and Michelle Nolan, who was a visiting scholar here a couple of years ago. By the way, she completely denies that this ever happened, but I know that it did. She called me over. She was working there at the time, and she called me over, and she's like, Pamela, you're really interested in animal farming, right? And I said, yes. She goes, look at this. There's this new technology that you can add certain bacteria to animal excrement, to the waste lagoons, to help break it down, to eliminate or at least mitigate some of the the pollution concerns. Isn't that great? And I said, yeah, that's really great, because I was working for her that summer. But afterwards I thought, see, that's it, right? Like, if you try to create laws that attack, bless you, a central concern by going around the side like this, like looking at only the environmental or the food safety issues, there are going to be ways to circumvent or to address those issues that don't involve actually addressing the animal welfare concerns. You know, pasteurizing eggs, as opposed to addressing the conditions in which the hens are laying the eggs, right? So you know, I go back and forth on it, but I think it's important to understand all of that, because you know, you carry your toolbox into every room that you walk into and meet somebody new, and you know, especially if you're in an advocacy position or lobbying in any way, you want to find out, like, what's this person I'm talking with, what does she care about? Does she care about environmental law? She got some kids that she's concerned about the food they eat, or you know, and then depending on what she cares about, you pull out like, oh, well, did you know about this? You know, and so it's good to know all that, right? But it can't be like, there also has to be discussion about, just for the sake of the animal welfare. Like, it says something about us. There's a reason why the very first animal cruelty laws, and even today in the Model Penal Code, if you look for where the animal cruelty laws in the Model Penal Code, they're in the section that has to do with societal behavior, like spitting on the sidewalk, or molesting a corpse, or raising a riot in public. The things that we just don't, this is just not something we condone in this society. It says something about us that's ugly, we don't like it, we don't support it. Same thing with mistreating our animals. It's base. It makes us less moral as a society if we condone it or practice it ourselves. And so I think there's something to that still today, but yeah. Yes, hi.
I was just wondering if you knew of like any potential solutions to CAFOs, because I just feel like that fish are so fundamentally different than like most other livestock in the fact that they are still wild animals. We haven't spent thousands of years domesticating them, and I was trying to think of like alternatives. It's like, oh, but they live in an open ocean, or they live on rivers. Like, how do you, like, what do you do to increase their welfare in those kind of situations?
So there's a difference between trying to increase the welfare of fish that are in the wild that are then caught or harvested by, you know, just in the fishing process, right? But if you're raising them in confinement, by the very nature of the what it is that you're trying to do, one of the things that you do is select breeding stock that's going to be genetically very much in, you know, the fish will be genetic conformity is going to be one of the things that you look for, and you know, that the stock will perform a certain way with a certain amount of food. In those confined facilities where they spend essentially all their lives before they're slaughtered, the welfare conditions are greater, and that's where you'd be looking to address the conditions. Do I know a solution to it? No, and the reason why that it's such a problem is it's cheap. It's so cheap. It's so efficient, in the same way that the way that we raise animals for food in other industrial facilities, it's incredibly efficient. It's admirable, but for you know, all the parade of horribles that comes along with it. But the, you know, so
The solution is we should give up eating these animals. Your personal solution.
it is my personal solution for myself, but I also realize that I live in the world, and a lot of people in the world like to eat meat, like to eat fish, like to drink milk, and I live with them and love them, and so we have to come up with some other solution. I like you even though you eat fish.
I've got a crazy racist uncle, and I can say hello to him at Christmas or something, but, I'm trying to, I want to limit his viewpoint in our society. And I take it that what you would like to see is a society in which the welfare of fish and other animals is more broadly accepted. And I guess the primary way of achieving that is to stop eating all these animals and become a vegetarian. I mean, I'm not trying to put you to the wall. I think there are a lot of vegetarians in the room.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think it's sort of the end of that. I would kind of flip it the other way around and say, if there are regulations or standards in place to address the welfare and at least try to improve the conditions for fish or any other animals raised in confinement, then that in and of itself eliminates some consumption. Just market forces are eliminating some practices. And so I think that the very first thing that has to happen is we're very much in that early education, very, very early education phase when it comes to aquaculture. I mean, we are, I would say, 15 years behind hens. So it's going to be a while. It's hot, but it's not as hot as it's going to be soon. We're like middle to, yeah.
How likely would it be because salmon, the salmon has already been engineered and it's been approved. Would it be to try to come up with a way to delete or modify the pain sensations?
Such a great question. And I think it has to be our last one, right, Laurie? Okay, so genetically engineered salmon has been approved for use by the FDA. It's not actually on the market, though, because there's no labeling system in place for that yet, so it's not available in the United States yet. But once genetic engineering of animals for food becomes more commonplace, which to me it seems inevitably it will be, that only raises concerns about invasive species, that kind of thing. But to the point of trying to eliminate the pain, two things. One, I know there has been that type of research conducted trying to engineer out anxiety and stress and pain. Absolutely. Do I think, I personally think that that's such a subjective thing to try and measure. The best you can do is measure physiological reactions to some stimuli or stimulus, but I think that's another one of those trying to solve a problem by approaching it, from the wrong side. And so, I think that it's an excellent question, but perhaps what is the most interesting kind of development when it comes to meat eating and our quandary, if you will, is the question of lab-grown meat. It exists today. People are eating it. The federal government is scrambling to regulate it. The meat industry is struggling to keep the label or the word meat off of packaging. I mean, so that's the kind of thing that's in your future. I should have just talked about that today, really, because that's even more hot, if you will. And so maybe that's ultimately the solution, lab-grown fish and shellfish. But anyway, thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with you.